Hi, Cora, and welcome to the Barrier Island Center. Thanks so much for being here today for our conversation in the kitchen.
Thanks for having me.
So I was very excited today that you allowed us to come down to the long-term ecological research station in Oyster, and you showed us around a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit about that that research center and what your role is there?
Absolutely. So I am the site director of UVA's Coastal Research Center in Oyster. That is a field station run by the University of Virginia that's on Oyster Harbor. So part of our role there is providing coastal access to the seaside of the Eastern Shore. So we help people from the University of Virginia and other collaborating institutions go out to the marshes, the oyster reefs, the barrier islands, all of what we consider the coastal bays of the Eastern Shore. And then within the Coastal Research Center, within the station itself, we have a program called the Long-Term Ecological Research Program. That has been going on since the mid-1980s, and that's a federally funded project that is focused on looking at long-term, broad-scale dynamics in those coastal systems.
Right. So tell me a little bit about that. So the Barrier Islands is, you know, I've been making films here for a number of years. I've been out there a lot. They're very dynamic ecosystems, right? So in the short term as well, right?
Yes.
So what are you trying to differentiate there between the changes that happen
In the system.
Yeah.
So for the LTER project, what we try to do is think about how systems function ecologically. And so we're looking at the movement of water, sediment, and organisms over space and time. And we are trying to determine, specifically here in Virginia, what kinds of changes are happening that are sort of directional over time, and then also what happens when you throw a disturbance in there. So if you have a big storm come through, how does that shift things around? And specifically in the past 6 to 8 years, we've really shifted our focus to think about the connectivity between systems. So we have a lot of interest and are doing a lot of research around things like the barrier islands have sandy beaches on the front, but they have salt marshes on the back. How do those two relate? How does the sand interact with the marsh? And then behind that marsh, there's a bay with oysters and now seagrass and mudflats. What do these do to each other? And so what we're starting to do is research that helps us discover things like seagrass slows the movement of water, and when the water movement slows, sediment falls out of the water to the bottom. So the water gets clearer and all the sediment collects in the bay. But in the winter, the seagrass dies back. When the seagrass dies back and our winter nor'easters and other storms come through, it whips the water up, it whips the sediment up, and it washes up onto the marshes, deposits sediment on the marshes, and that helps marshes grow in elevation, keep the plants vibrant, and sort of keep them from drowning. And then it turns out that marsh platform is what barrier islands build on. So the reason our barrier islands don't drown as sea levels rise or when big storms come through is because the sand washes onto what we would call the marsh platform. And so that is sort of the foundation of a barrier island. And on some of our islands that are really dynamic and moving fast, people may have seen, if you go around to the ocean side, you'll see these fingers of peat sticking out into the ocean, and that's where the island is rolling so fast that the sand has washed all the way back, so the marsh base is sticking out into the ocean. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to understand, the rate at which those things are happening, the interdependencies, sort of what is it that causes these things to work nicely or to, you know, create a change where one system is lost or one type of plant is lost, or like why are some of our islands moving one way and others are moving another way.
So you mentioned the movement of the islands. Like for the faster moving islands, do you have an estimate of like how much they might move, say, in a year?
10 meters a year, something like that. So
wow.
it's a funny thing. So there are a lot of other LTER sites all over the country. There's about 28 sites. And within this big network where everybody's studying long-term landscape changes, the Virginia site is considered a high-speed landscape. And it's a weird, you're like, what is a high-speed landscape?
Yeah.
But no, you know, prairies don't move 10 meters a year. Mountains don't move 10 meters. Nothing moves 10 meters a year. And
yeah,
so we often see islands that are shifting 10 meters a year. And the people who live here see that. If you go out to the Barrier Islands from year to year, the bottom of the island is shaped completely differently the next time you go back. Or, the cabin that used to be there when you were a kid has washed into the ocean. So people see those changes, but once you start measuring them and quantifying them and comparing them to other parts of the world, then they're really astounding.
You're actually from the Eastern Shore, which is, I think, really interesting. I'd love to hear about your journey from growing up here, and then, give us a little bit of, what your childhood was like, maybe, how you came to have this interest, and you were telling me a little earlier about, all your places of study, and then how you actually ended up back here, but maybe you could relate that.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Wachapreague, which is on the seaside, and grew up very in tune to this coastal place. So I grew up on a farm and had a small boat. My parents have an 18-foot privateer, and every weekend some families go to church. My family went out to the Barrier Islands, and there was a group of friends. That was where the community was built, where the people that are like your second dad, your second mom, your closest friend. Those were the people that we would go out to the Barrier Islands with on a regular basis and sort of picnic and swim. So that was really, I don't remember my life before going to the Barrier Islands. And it was a pretty perfect Eastern Shore childhood. While I was in college, every summer I came home and got a science internship here on the shore. So I worked on the Barrier Islands doing bird surveys and then tracking the terrapin turtle populations. And those were incredibly formative because I was given my own boat and truck. I learned to trailer boats. I had already learned how to boat. I had been doing that for a long time, but I was in charge of the whole rig by the time I was a sophomore in college.
So then what happened to bring you full circle? You made your escape.
Yes, I did.
You hatched your escape plan, you got out, you saw the world, and then something pulled you back here.
So I never planned to come back to the Eastern Shore. And after my PhD, I went to California for a postdoc, which is sort of like a residency for scientists. And out there, I was applying for jobs all over the country. Oregon, Gulf Coast, basically anywhere there was a coastline of some kind, I was applying for a job. And one of the jobs that came up was the director of the LTER and the Coastal Research Center here on the shore. And I lived in Wachapreague, which is up the road, and the LTER in Oyster is very far down the road. And so I had been there maybe once. I barely knew it existed. It was not something that I knew a lot about when I was living here. But I saw the job ad, and it had a lot of the things I wanted. In particular, in all of my adventures all over doing science, part of what I discovered is I really loved field work, which made sense. I spent a lot of time outside on boats. I spent a lot of time exploring. I really liked that boots in the mud part of science. And I particularly liked the people that were most helpful. So there were often lab managers or coordinators or those it wasn't the faculty. The faculty were just throwing big ideas but hadn't been in the field for years. And it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to be a student getting paid nothing and eating peanut butter sandwiches for the rest of my life, but there was these intermediate people who knew the big ideas, but they also knew where the water was deep, where the best sampling locations were, how to safely rig up your gear, how to build equipment in the field. And those were the people I loved. Those were the mentors that excited me the most. And so this position as the director of the Coastal Research Center falls right on that nexus again. So I spend some of my time in big meetings coordinating important things, and then I spend time driving boats and helping students with their first time ever getting on an oyster reef or getting into a seagrass meadow and helping them troubleshoot when things aren't working. And so I really like that combination. So when I saw that,
still get your feet in the mud.
Exactly, exactly. It's here I even on a good day get a combination. So I'll go out at sunrise, help somebody sample, and it's gorgeous, right? You're in the coastal bays at sunrise, and then come in by midday, take a quick shower at our facility, and then put on the meeting garb, and then I'm in a meeting with decision makers about coastal resilience before 3 p.m.
So your experience having grown up here, what do you think that brings to your position, your job, that maybe a director who had similar education as you but did not have that formative experience of growing up here and experiencing the shore, what's the difference there? What do you think that's brought to your work?
So I think that's actually a large part of the reason I got the job, because I applied very early in my career, and so this was when I considered it, looking at my resume and the job, I thought this was kind of a stretch. I don't know that I'm going to get this job. But when I came to the interview and then having the amount of both local landscape knowledge of the waterways and the ecosystems and just already being very comfortable and familiar with them, and knowing the community, knowing people in the schools, having people that recognize me, knowing the language that gets used, was just, it was clear both to them when hiring me, and then it has been really clear in my experience that my startup was so much faster and smoother because I didn't have to figure all of that out. It was much easier to, it's been throughout the whole process of being employed there, been much easier when we had an opportunity or we had a need to know things like a starting point. Who am I going to contact if we want to take this science into the schools? Or who should I talk to if we need to reach people about a research finding? And then having those people be very receptive to me contacting them, in part because they know me or we have a shared history. And then it also helps that the prior site director was very beloved, Art Schwartzchild. So that certainly helped also. And I think on the science side, knowing that these waterways are so complex, and all the watermen and people who live here, they'll say that, but they also know it, right? You just like learn, it's almost like people on rivers learning to read the water. And that kind of thing, it was so much easier to come in. There's so much to figure out when you come in and take over. You know, I'm overseeing the field station, all the operations, housing, lab spaces, research supplies, schedules, all of that. And then also coordinating education and outreach and coordinating the research itself that's happening within the facility. So that's a lot to get oriented to and to figure out. And so just being able to take away that part of also having to figure out the landscape and the people, I think it's made it a lot easier. And it's been enjoyable for me also to be able to go back to the scientists and say, we need to shift the way you're talking about this, or we need to use slightly different language in the way that we're engaging people, or just like, you know, one year we had a total showdown with a faculty member because he wanted a student to present results about a crab trap, things they found with crab traps, and it was like, they're crab pots here. When you go to some national conference, you can call them crab traps, but here they are not crab traps.
Pots.
They're crab pots.
Well, I guess I wanted to ask you, my follow-up to that was sort of like, is there a broader lesson there about incorporating the community, in your case, someone who's actually, you know, working for this research organization, but also being from the community. But so we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that idea of the research people from elsewhere, the scientific, you know, thing that comes down like a spaceship, parachutes in,
collecting data,
and then yeah. And so, how important is it today to have that sort of, I guess the buzzword would be intersectional, but like to be able to have that intersection between community experience and involvement and background and history and kind of forward-thinking research, and like is that, I guess in some sense I'm asking, is that a good model for how this should be done in a larger sense?
I think everybody is moving more towards what we call community engaged science, or what some people call youth inspired research, you know, research that does something helpful for people or ecosystems. And that's something that I think it does help, having sort of one foot in each world. It does help with knitting that together, but it's a big process. And it's actually, I think sometimes being from here makes it easier. And I think sometimes being from here makes it challenging. And you know, sometimes I go to work and it's just like, scientists, stop being so sciencey, you know? And I kind of see both sides of it because I have a training in science, I have my PhD in science, I understand what everyone's trying to do, but then getting the two to talk. My first couple years here, I just worked myself to death because I was like, I can personally translate for everyone and make these connections. And I could do it to a certain extent, but then I was just completely burned out. And so it's been a lot of figuring out, like, how do we get people talking to each other so that I'm not the only one that speaks both languages? How
do you educate people to speak that language, and so that they can communicate in that way?
So how do we send it in both directions? And that's, I mean, it takes a lot of time. We have both the benefit and the challenge at the LTER that we don't do a lot of research on some of the sensitive topics that that get people riled up. So like we don't do a lot of fisheries population assessments that might go into things like stock assessments and regulations.
Spoken to watermen, and they have opinions about that.
Yes, yes, right? So like it's hard. When you do that kind of work, it's really important work, but it's also, once you are known for that sort of thing, sometimes your gear gets magically removed, or things get ruined, that sort of thing. So in some ways, the fact that we don't do that kind of research makes it easier to maintain good relations in the community. At the same time, we do a lot of things like the rate of carbon storage in seagrass meadows, and that is not of terribly wonderful use or interest to people on the Eastern Shore.
Right.
And so there's a little bit
data.
of a balance there,
Yeah.
of doing things that don't offend people, but also they're not as relevant. And so part of what we're also trying to do is like, how do we do the really important sort of field shifting science that is what will keep people funded and keep research moving and keep the state of knowledge in the world increasing, while also trying to do things that are relevant and stay in touch with the community so they understand what we're doing. And here it's a really interesting balance, because being this sort of last natural frontier of undisturbed coastline, it is such a good reference point for so much of the world where nobody did this, right? Where Ocean City got built and the Outer Banks got built and all these other locations, West Palm, whatever it is, most places have been built, and it's really hard to go back and figure out, like, what does this system need to be resilient? What would this system do? Would it still be here if we let it move? And so we're doing research, and it's in some ways important for the Eastern Shore because it shows what's happening right here, but it also is creating lessons that then can be taken to all these places where people didn't have as much foresight or as much opportunity to leave things pristine and learn from nature, to learn, how do these systems work? How do they remain so dynamic and so robust? Because part of what we're learning is dynamic and robust are what sort of dynamic and resilient go together. A system is resilient because it's dynamic, because it's shifting, it's moving. Anything that you sort of pin down, that's when you start losing marsh, losing island.
Build the jetties and the causeways.
Yes, exactly.
Those are
exactly.
not movable.
Yes.
And and we were talking about that earlier, just this ecological gem here, this uniqueness of that huge stretch of undisturbed, coastal wilderness are not, that's not two words that go together usually.
Not often, but that's what we have here is coastal wilderness.
And so the, as you were saying earlier, the application of those lessons is much bigger than just the shore, in a sense, because you have something in its not original state, because it's always shifting, but in an undisturbed, pre-development state.
Yes.
Which is
Absolutely.
Extraordinary.
Yes. At the same time, we have a responsibility to make sure we share enough of the findings and enough of the relevant information with the Eastern Shore that we're not just taking all the information from this pristine landscape that this community has worked so hard to keep in a good state,
Right.
and just like exporting it to the rest of the world as knowledge,
Well,
right? So that's the balance.
Avoiding the colonial model, which is something it's very relevant to documentary filmmaking today too. There are sort of new directions about that people are moving in, just about, in a sense, your documentary subjects are kind of thought more of as collaborators now, even, and that their consent with what you're doing is really important. Now this, you can't say that globally, because there are certain, in documentary filmmaking, sometimes it is an antagonistic or a critical approach, especially if you're doing something investigative. But if you're doing something that's really about, especially down here, these films that I do, which are about the cultural milieu and the history and the meaning of all these social and cultural, traditions, it really is, in a sense, the people of the shore are co-makers, in a sense, of this thing that I do with the Barrier Island Center. So it is, and what you want to avoid is that sort of extractive model. I went into, I did a film a few years back, which was in an indigenous community, and that was a real leap for me, because I had, to be honest, no idea what I was doing. And sometimes you take that leap, and then I figured out a way, but you have to figure out, how am I going to create this this work about this place that doesn't somehow exploit it, or and so you really need buy-in. I hate that word, but you need that collaborative process. What we ended up doing with that film is having this collaboration, and I think that's a really key way to go. It was a collaboration between indigenous and non-indigenous filmmakers, and we sort of together worked on this, and which sort of solves part of that problem that you were talking about. Like, you know, you're not just like extracting stuff and using this great place as this is going to be award-winning research.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it can be that, but you really, you know, it's very important to incorporate the where you are and the values of that place into your work.
So that's one of the things I'm really excited moving forward. We've been talking to the community and talking to the scientists and trying to figure out what are opportunities we've missed for shared engagement, for synthesis, that sort of thing. And one of the things that has come up, and in retrospect, I'm like, I should have seen this. This will be really interesting, is a shared sense of affinity for this place, a shared sense of awe and appreciation. That's something that the people who work the water here, the people who, you know, spend their free time out on the water, there, you know, people who moved to the shore, I feel like I've talked to people who've moved to the shore and said, you know, like, I didn't really care about salt marshes when I moved here. And like 5-10 years in, it's like, salt marshes are beautiful. Like watching the seasons change in a salt marsh, there's nothing like it.
Right.
The different color, you can tell the season just by the colors of the marsh, that sort of thing. And the researchers, you know, they come from these universities and they're all harried and everything's busy and stressful and like data and experiments. And you put them on a boat and you head out towards the islands and you can just feel this like, and they talk, I mean, a couple of years ago. It just
melts away the tension of.
And they just love it. And they very consistently will say like, wow, this place is gorgeous. And we've done, a few years ago, some of the different LTR sites did a program where they sort of were like, everybody give us the colors of your sites. And the students got so, it was Fashion Week. And so it was like, create a color palette for your research area. And the students got so excited by how beautiful this landscape is and all the colors and the way it feels so vibrant. And so I think that that's something we're starting to look for ways that we can bring the scientists and the community together, sometimes not to talk so much about data, but just to talk more about the fact that they choose to spend their time here. Both people do. That they choose to, you know, like you could do your research off of some Pacific isle and instead you're here studying the shallow coastal bays of the Eastern Shore.
Right.
And generally it's because they love it here.
It's that care and that connection to the natural world, which is often so missing in a lot of modern life. And it's one of the beautiful things about the way of life here is that connection comes readily.
Yes.
And as you note, even people who, you know, come from somewhere else and maybe came from a city and I'm just going to retire here, but like,
get very,
you know, you settle into it and you start to understand those, even if it's intuitively, those processes that, you know, you could scientifically write papers about, but just being part of that.
Yes.
And we are part of that, you know, that it is like a lot of the problems with the modern age is that people have become too disconnected, I think, from the natural world, from natural processes, from even just things like food, you know.
Absolutely.
Where does your food come from? I mean, I think it's changing. I think people are, you know, even where I live, you know, which is suburban New York State, not really only 45 miles, 50 miles from New York City, you're seeing chicken coops pop up in people's yards and goats and you know, big gardens, and like people want that connection and their understanding that you know how important it is. So, but here there's, you know, there's just so much space and land and.
And I mean, that's part of deciding to come back here was in part because I wanted to come back to a place where I could have more space, and also like space on the coast.
Land and
there
water,
are not many places where you can get access to the ocean and have space, like can't see a neighbor or, you know, it's quiet. There are not that many. I mean, I was doing field research in Florida and I would be out at 2 a.m. on the water and you could hear traffic and you could hear people yell and you're like, where are all these humans?
Yes.
And so that was sort of a common theme when I left for college, when I went to graduate school. And I would always be like, it's so crowded. There's all these people and they're all too close to me. And everyone was always like, what are you talking about? And my husband, I brought him back here with me. I met him in Florida. We went to California together, and he moved back to the Eastern Shore with me. And now, and he used to be like, I never really got what you were talking about. And now we will go other places, and he'll be like, it's so crowded. What are all these people doing here?
But it's all baseline, like what people get used to anything. I remember when I was growing up, we lived a little further north than I live now. It was pretty much the country then, Dutchess County, New York. And my Italian relatives from the Bronx would come up and they'd stay over. And in the morning they'd go, I don't know how you can sleep here. It's so noisy.
Noisy. Oh, it's noisy.
No,
oh,
it's so
the
noisy.
Yeah,
yes. We'd be like, what? And they're like, those birds and those crickets. Meanwhile, they lived like 2 blocks from the subway out,
right.
which would
It's
screech by, but they didn't
noise.
hear it
Yes.
because you get used to what you're in.
Yeah. I've heard people say that about the Eastern Shore, but it's the wind. People come and visit, and they're like, I couldn't sleep. It was so windy all night.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas, like, to me, that's very comforting.
It's such a nice sound.
It's just like, when wind moving across the water. One of the things that I really have, so coming back here, one of the things that I really enjoyed is just realizing, like, when I left, I didn't realize, we'll say how pristine, I don't know if pristine is the right word, how pristine it was. And you sort of leave seeking tropical places and exotic places and fascinating, I wanted to go explore the exotic realms of the world. And by the time I came back here, I had, just maybe the summer before, spent 5 weeks on Palmyra Atoll, which is the farthest piece of land from any other piece of land in the world. It's out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it's, it's very cool. It's very exotic. And everyone says, like, it is pristine. It's the only place in the world they've removed all of the rats that came from ships, so there are no rodents on the island, and it's this, like, really exciting experiment. I came up here, and I'm like, it's way nicer here. It's like, we have less trash on our beaches than Palmyra Atoll, and it's in the middle of the Pacific, in the middle of nowhere. And so it's been fascinating to go and see all these other places and be like, they're cool. They're very cool. But then when you come back and look at this place with a different lens, then being able to realize, like, that it's right here and it's really beautiful.
But you needed that journey away to see what the rest of the world was, to appreciate what's here. I mean, I've often said that, and it should never actually be done because it would ruin it. But this place could easily be a national park.
Oh yeah.
This is national park here. This is a completely unusual
treasure
ecological city. But if you did that,
it'd be covered in people.
You'd have infrastructure, people, and you couldn't.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult, given how fragile and dynamic it all is. I don't know how you would logistically do that. You can't call something a park and not have people come to it. So I don't know.
Yeah,
we'll leave that for future generations
to
figure out.
But it is.
But
we've had that discussion.
It is that level. Yeah, I think it's that level of uniqueness, unique wilderness, very, very important ecologically, and really sort of very American in a sense. Just the way that coast is, the types of plants and the types of indigenous wildlife.
Yes.
It's so, it's, to me, it's a Yellowstone or a Yosemite.
So one of our researchers that works with the LTER, one of the things she does is she comes and surveys the red knots, the birds that migrate through. And she gave a presentation last year that was just amazing. I hadn't realized, so red knots leave southern Argentina, Tierra del Fuego, and start flying, and the next place they land is on the Barrier Islands of the Eastern Shore. They fly the distance to the moon and back in their lifetimes. And then they continue to the Arctic. But it was one of those things that made several of us were like, why don't we have like major like ritual celebrations or something when the red knots arrive? Like it just seems like a sort of cosmic event that these birds, and the amazing thing is when they go up in the air, people don't actually know where they are. They have a really hard time finding them and tracking them, but they fly thousands and thousands of miles and land here. And this is where they eat. This is where they rest during storms. And it's the idea of thinking, when you think about the coast, coming up and thinking about all the development and all the things, and then thinking like, these birds must be so relieved when they sort of drop elevation, and these Barrier Islands are exactly the way they have been for thousands of years, just waiting for them to do what they've always done and then move on to the Arctic. It's wild.
Just the sort of biological
Yeah.
possibility of that is sort of
Yeah.
mind-boggling.
Oh,
Like,
and it's
how is that
bizarre.
little, where's the energy
They
coming from, you know?
reabsorb all their internal organs before they fly. Their stomachs, their intestines, all of this, they just like absorb it into energy, muscle mass and
Wow.
energy. They completely reconstitute
then
their
they grow it
bodies
back?
and then they grow it back. It's
Wow.
wild. It's wild.
That is crazy,
But
yeah.
it's wild because like this place must be so precious, those birds, and they live a long, long, long time. So I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was very heartbreaking when she talked about these birds live long enough that they've seen their populations drop by like more than half within a single lifetime. So like probably the kind of thing that these birds are noticing, right?
Wow.
That like their populations have gone way down and they've been alive to see that change.
Huh.
But at the same time, like most people don't even notice when these birds come through. We don't think about it. But I think that's part of the, when we're always doing the balance of like how much human access do we have, how much do we save them for the birds. It's like, I want to spend as much time on the islands as I can like everybody else does. But then I feel like when I learn things like that, I'm like, right, this is like, there are so few places left in the world where organisms can find refuge like that. And like, I don't mind staying below the high tide line if it means that they can come and rest here after flying all the way from Tierra del Fuego on their way to the Arctic. Like, I'm cool with that. That's okay.
The birds, I was talking about this with an audience the other night, but because I was shooting on Cobb Island, and if you're there during nesting season, the birds let you know
Oh, yes.
that they don't really approve
No.
of your presence.
Yes.
And I was out there with a previous intern, not you, Blake, but and he was quite freaked out because they were diving
Oh,
at
they
us
do.
and
Yes.
stuff. And
Yes. I've been hit in the head with unhappy turns before.
yes,
so.
yeah. So it was like, I think we're close to their nesting
Yes,
ground, so
we need
we
to
can
back
move a little
away.
bit further up the beach and
Yes.
shoot over there. But even just having that experience is an amazing
Yes.
thing because you really realize this is not your element. This is like the home of other creatures. And so, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
it's good to visit, and if we can keep our footprints literally
Yes.
and otherwise minimal, but
Yes. And so some of the
yeah.
kinds of things that the research project has been finding is, for example, with the birds. So not only do they survey the red knots, but then they are surveying things like all the intertidal invertebrates and things. So when you see birds going along the water line, and they're looking at all of those things, they're looking at how much marsh is available, how much sand flat is available, what's living in those things, and tracking those changes over time, and starting to be able to see how that correlates to where you find birds, how long they stay, and sort of we can look at how those changes are progressing. With other birds, so with things like the oyster catchers, plovers, it's not, I mean, conditions are getting really rough. It's one of those things where when people talk about, like climate change is coming, and then other people say like, no, it's already here, and it's going to be hard for humans and organisms. For some of these birds, we're starting to see things like the birds arrive, they nest early, they get good nests going, and then the spring tides hit, the highest tides of the year, wash all the nests out. The nests are gone. So then the birds have to start over. They start over, they nest again. By that time, it's pushed them late enough in the season that their nests cook in the sun.
Oh.
Because it's been getting so hot, the birds will go down and lay in the water to cool off on some
Yeah.
of the islands, but they won't do that if there's people and dogs and other things out there.
Right, yeah.
So, but being able to, I mean, it's like you look at these populations and you think, how on earth will they ever persist
Right.
if they drown if they nest too early
Yeah.
and they bake if they nest too late? There's nothing left. They're getting squeezed from the two sides of the season. And so that's
Yeah.
where like there are precious few places left, even within these islands, where they can thread that needle between
Yeah, yeah.
big floods and too hot.
Well, I suppose we're into now what you're talking about is the dynamism almost on an evolutionary scale, where there are all these fluctuations over time, and
Yeah.
the populations that can figure out how to adapt or somehow thread the needle, as you say,
Yeah.
can survive. But
Yes. But
not everything
the
does.
changes are happening
Yeah,
fast, and evolution's not always a very fast process. So
No.
it'll be,
I think it goes in, I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but from what I've read, it sort of does go in sort of fast phases, and then, but
Yeah.
other times things are not changing
Yes.
rapidly, but
yeah, absolutely. And
But
and so the other kinds of things that we think about also are not just the animals, but things like the plants. So marshes, part of what we do is figure out like how do you maintain a marsh. So if you have water levels rising, marshes like to be at a very specific amount, people say they like to have their feet wet. They don't like to be completely inundated.
Right.
And so we do a lot of like, how much does a marsh have to either move up or move in to be a healthy, vibrant marsh? And then thinking about, as sea levels rise, as storms get bigger, what does that do to the ability of a marsh to shift in the landscape? And one of the things that we have that is promising on the Eastern Shore, if we let it happen, is having so much natural edge, right? So few seawalls, so few hardened infrastructure, that there is space. We have these low, long slopes where if we let it, the marsh will head inland, essentially, to safety, and continue to provide us all of the refuge from storms and storm surge. I mean, it's amazing how much marsh can slow down waves and water energy. And part of what we've found is that everybody thought storms were bad for marshes, that they, rip them out, do all this. It turns out storms whip up all the energy, whip up all the sediment in the water, wash up onto a marsh, and then the marsh slows it down, and it dumps all that sediment on the marsh, and that marsh is now higher. And so it's more likely to be high enough to survive the next storm, and then the next storm. So storms actually nourish them.
Right.
And it's just like, if we give them enough room to do their thing, they're very good at adjusting.
But just having them is like, again, it's like, if you
Huge.
fly over that salt marsh, like, there's a lot more than that, than the barrier islands, it's that,
Yes.
but that space in between.
Yes.
Is so vital.
Yes, I mean the barrier islands creating that protective edge, that's what creates this really expansive lagoon network and marsh network inside, and that's why our fisheries are so good.
Right.
It's why we have this space. It's why we don't have so much development. People don't want to live on salt marshes. We do. But, people don't want to build condos on salt marshes as much. They want to see an ocean front, and so it's harder to get to our oceans. We have issues of equity of you have to have enough money to have a boat, you have to have enough free time to get out there. They're not as easy to access, but because they provide that protection, you get this big coastal expanse that really feeds into everything about our identity and our economics here on the shore.
Sure. I want to talk about a couple of the specific projects that you're working on or have been part of. So you have one called the Climate Equity Project, so maybe you could tell me a little more about that.
Yes. Yeah, so this is, when we were talking about language earlier, so this is something we've been talking to people about as the Climate Equity Atlas for the Eastern Shore. And last night, a couple of our scientists just had dinner with a bunch of local residents, and we sort of talked about this, and pretty quickly we're told, don't use the word climate, don't use the word equity, and don't use the word atlas. Like, okay.
So far, so good.
Start again.
Yeah, no,
So,
we were talking about that earlier, though. Even the words and the language that you're using can either turn people off or make them think that you're speaking to them and not at them.
Yes.
And so it's so critical.
So this project, which is probably going to get renamed something like the Eastern Shore Livability Wayfinding Tool. Sure, something. We'll figure it out. But it was very interesting because that's more the direction people wanted it. Felt like knowing the project, that's what we should be talking about. This is a project that's a collaboration. It's led by individuals at UVA, but then there's other institutions participating. And it is working, so a couple of years ago, we talked about how we have all these environmental data layers. We have these environmental maps of like, we know where the water is, we know where the soil is, we know where the watersheds are, we know, where the flooding happens. And then there are maps of people, but we don't have those map layers integrated well. And we haven't thought carefully. So this actually came up in part because of when we were thinking about community engagement. It was like, how do we engage with community members that are not like wealthy waterfront homeowners? But then part of my problem is I was like, what is my message for the people who don't live? We talk about living shorelines, we talk about oyster restoration, we talk about, making sure your marsh has room to move. And so we have to figure, what is the message for everyone else? And part of it was we need to figure out how all these layers of environmental data intersect with everybody else's lives and what they experience. And so this is a much more robust project and collaboration that grew out of other coastal resilience work on the shore and out of this idea of like, we need to know how people and environmental change overlap so that we can see how different people are experiencing changes and find the pockets where someone is inordinately feeling a really heavy impact. So a place where maybe historical inequities forced a community to develop in an area that is lower elevation or has bad drainage because that was the less desirable property. Well, now those people need more help with septic systems than everybody else, right? And it's not their fault, it's a systematic problem, but we can use data to overlay those two and figure out we should be spending our resources to, ditch in these places or to help these people, find another place to move or get money to put their house up or whatever that may be. And so this is a collaborative project where there are community advisors, there are scientists, and the scientists will sort of say, like, here's what we think might be helpful. And then the community is invited to say, no, that's all wrong. That's not how people actually live, or that's not what we're dealing with. So the kinds of things that have come up are the scientists came into it very focused on things like coastal flooding, storm surge, that sort of thing. And the community immediately showed up and said, heavy rainstorms, inland flooding, standing water in Exmoor, standing water in other communities. That's a big problem. Nobody's talking to us about it. And they were like, oh. And went back and started pulling more data layers and said, you're right, there's a ton of places where water is expected to stand.
These are the people who are your frontline observers, in a sense. Your frontline field work is already there.
Yes.
If you just talk to them.
Yes, exactly.
And
the tricky thing, so the goal is that this will provide information that helps people make good decisions and helps decision makers and people who control resources figure out how do we direct those so that everybody can thrive on the Eastern Shore and sort of has some option for the future moving forward and can sort of maintain the things they need to do well. But it's been interesting because, for example, less interest in storm surge, even though it's important occasionally, more interest in sunny day flooding. The seasonal really high tides and then a northeast wind hits and then, like all of a certain street is underwater and you have to drive through it to drop your kids off at daycare. And there's like, I can do that and then go to the car wash a couple of times, but how much is too much? It's sort of, some people call it the ratchet popping.
Yeah.
Concept of like if somebody starts popping ratchets out of the airplane that you're on, how many do they pop before you decide to get off the airplane?
Yeah.
And so this is
the tipping point. Yeah.
Right, but the problem is everyone who's working in this kind of area is figuring out it's hard to know what that tipping point is until you're in it. Yeah. So even if you came to me and said, how many days would be too many days to drive through salt water before you decide to put your kid in another preschool? Or move?
Yeah.
I don't know. I probably will know when I can't afford to get a new car because this car rusted out, or when I realize I have a different childcare option that I didn't know I had before. And so it's been a really important dialogue. I don't think we're going to get it perfect, but I think it is making progress. Because of doing this, we try to make you a map or a tool, and we hand it to you, and you say, cool, but not quite right. Hand it back. It gets iterated again. Hand it back. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to get it to be as useful as possible to address the issues people are really facing, to help people understand what does the future look like, who needs help, how can we help people, how can we best maintain a vibrant community on the Eastern Shore through climate change.
I was thinking, just listening to you, there's like a social and political aspect to that, because some of your recommendations have, well, to implement them would take sort of political will in a sense. Like you're saying, like, oh, well, the people who really need the help are the people who structurally have not had the same infrastructure put in and access to it. But just saying that, I'm sure, can create,
flare-ups,
political resistance. I'm just putting it out there. I don't even know what the solution to that is, but that's where I think it's a lot of what we're talking about is the difference between, science on paper and science in the real world, and how does this intersect with communities, with governments, with money, with politics. Like, it must get very complicated.
It does. I think one of the things that's exciting about doing this work on the Eastern Shore, so the Eastern Shore has one of the highest rates of relative sea level rise in the world. Right, it has to do with where we are on the continental plate and glaciers and all that, and also, ocean currents, all kinds of things. So we have very high sea level. So we're sort of considered the early signs. We're sort of canary in the coal mine for what's coming. But that's why researchers are excited about it, working here. The reason I am excited, and excited is a weird word, because I'm a person who lives on the Eastern Shore, so sea level rise and threats like that are very real. I'm looking at calculations and being like, can we live in this house until my son goes to college, or do we need to move before that? It's it's the kind of stuff that makes you lay awake at night and think what did we spend our money on? What are we doing? But I think one of the things that's exciting about doing it on the shore is that there is a sense of resilience and adaptability and innovation built deep, deep, deep into the culture and heritage of this place. So, I live in Willis Wharf right now, and my neighbors live in houses that were brought over from Hog Island. Mm-hmm. And we're reaching a point where we're probably gonna have to move them again, but it's not even the first time those houses have been moved, mm-hmm. right? So it's like there have been our forefathers and other residents of the shore, there has always been this, we can figure it out, we can move things around. We live right on the edge, but when you live right on the edge, you have to be a little careful, and sometimes you have to change what you're doing. And I think that comes up a lot right now in aquaculture. They're in a rough spot because you need to be right on the edge of the water in order to do things like pump water through your systems, but you also don't want to be flooded. How do you navigate that? And I think we have a real opportunity on the shore. There may not be appetite for the government to parachute in and say, we'll move all your houses for you, and everyone's back off, leave us alone.
That may not work.
Right? That is almost certainly not going to work.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is a really deep history here of having done those sorts of things in the past. Sure. And so I feel like part of it is we have to figure out how to help people be able to do what they want to do most and sort of get out of the way.
I think it's presenting the options, but not saying this is the one you have to do. I think that's the key.
What's the pathway? What are the resources you can use? How can we make it easy? I heard an economist talk once who said, we were talking about ecology and the environment and conservation, that sort of thing, and that's what he said. And he said the thing is, incentives are things that help people who already want to do things do those things they want to do. Incentives don't change people's minds. Yeah. And I feel like this is one of those things where how do we make it easy to do what you think is, what you're pretty sure is right, but maybe you're not quite ready to make that jump. I think that's the kind of space we need to move into.
Right. The seagrass restoration,
yes.
is that a project that's going through your institution, or is that?
So the seagrass restoration off the coast of the Eastern Shore has been a big collaborative endeavor. So we've actually talked about the need for a diagram that explains everybody's role in it. Essentially, as long as I have, as much as I have the story straight, since a lot of it was done before I started here, local watermen and researchers found patches of seagrass behind Wreck Island in the late 1990s, like 1997-ish. And that was the first anybody had documented seagrass since it was sort of wiped out by the storm of 1933, which pushed people off of Hog Island. Right. So people found seagrass. Everyone got excited. Researchers from VIMS, from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, over in Gloucester Point, the sort of main campus, had been working on trying to figure out how to restore seagrass, mostly in the Chesapeake. And they came over and started trying their methods here. And they had figured out, so Bob Orth had figured out some good methods for seeding seagrass. And so because there were some here, it's let's try it here. As it turns out, so in ecology, we talk about press versus pulse stressors. And it turns out that in this system, it wasn't that constant pressure. So in the Chesapeake, there's this constant pressure of water quality issues and sediment and fertilizer, and it's just always stressed out. Here, it was more of a pulse. There was a disease that was presenting a challenge for the seagrass, but then that hurricane came through, and in a pulse, it just wiped so much of the seagrass out that it couldn't persist. But the water quality is so good, and the stressor is gone. So when VIMS came and started seeding, it took, and the seagrass was growing. And so then Coastal Zone Management, CZM, the Nature Conservancy, VIMS, there's probably other partners I'm going to forget, brought in money and worked systematically to restore a bunch of the seagrass. The role of the LTER was that we have the funding to do long-term research, and we're really interested in ecosystem function. And so we collaborated with them to do the restoration in patterns that let us study different dynamics. So for example, in Hog Island Bay, they restored patches of a certain size at different depths so that we could map that out and better understand what is the optimum location for seagrass, how does it change, where does it spread, those sorts of things. And so we're looking at carbon uptake, oxygenating the water, looking at how the water clears. And so we've been really working on the so what, when you restore the seagrass, what happens to the system. Right. And that's what we're focused on. So now there's over 10,000 acres of restored seagrass. There are entire bays seeding themselves that have not been assisted. And the seagrass has had a major die-off event because of a heat wave and completely recovered without any assisted seeding. So it's a very robust, lush
So
ecosystem.
Once it reestablishes,
Yes.
it finds a way.
Yes, and that
to
I mean, part of the challenge with seagrass restoration has been that seagrass is sort of self-perpetuating. So seagrass is a flowering plant that photosynthesizes, so it needs enough light to keep from starving. And seagrass, because it creates drag, gets the sediment out of the water, so the water is really clear in a seagrass meadow. When the water's clear, more light hits the bottom. And so where you have seagrass, it causes seagrass to thrive because there's plenty of light. If you don't have great water quality, it's hard to get enough seagrass growing from the beginning to clear the water enough to have enough light hit the bottom for it to really thrive. So it's like, but once it catches, if you get enough, then it clears the water and then it starts making spaces that are better and better. So it sort of engineers its own best conditions.
Right. The other thing I saw on your website was the Soundscape project. What's that all about?
So this is a collaboration that they call the Coastal Conservatory. This is a UVA collaboration. It is religious studies, the music department, and environmental sciences. And then there are other collaborators. And it's housed at the Coastal Research Center. That's sort of the home of this conservatory. And the conservatory is sort of this play of conservation, that sort of idea, or like a conservatory where plants grow, and then a conservatory, the kind of place where people compose music.
Where you learn about art.
Right,
music.
exactly, exactly. And so it's been a really amazing project where the whole focus has been on listening. And the folks from the music department have come out and they have done coastal recordings. So they have put hydrophones in the water. They've gone around with microphones to record different coastal systems. So they're trying to sort of map the sounds of the landscape. But then they've also done amazing work. They've taken our data sets. So we have these, because we're a long-term ecological research program, we have data sets that are decades and decades and decades of like phosphorus fluctuations in the seagrass meadow, right? Which is amazing data to have, but trying to do things like community engagement with like, let's talk about fluctuations in phosphorus. It's just like people fall asleep.
Yeah.
But they've taken this data and they've sonified it. So they will take it and say, okay, if phosphorus goes up, the pitch goes up. If nitrogen goes down, the tempo goes down. And so they've created these layers where they can take the data and then you can listen to the changes that are happening over time in these coastal systems. And they often interweave them with the sounds you actually hear when you're out there. So like if you sit underwater in a seagrass meadow, the sounds that you hear. And part of the goal of this project that I think has been really successful so far is this idea that we all come to the coast and climate and conservation with these sort of preconceived, somewhat ingrained notions. People kind of know where they stand on things and we'll fight for that. And we don't always do a great job of listening to each other very openly. And that when we see things, we have very clear impressions of what we're seeing. Like you see a graph and you're like, that's not man-made.
Yeah.
That's a natural phenomenon. Whatever it may be, people are much more certain. And we're not used to things like listening to data. And it sort of puts everybody on a back foot. And everybody sort of takes a beat and is like, I don't know what that is, but I can tell there's a pattern.
Yeah.
And that's a thread for conversation. And it's a way, so the idea has been, it's about listening to each other. It's about listening to nature. It's about learning to be more open to understanding the natural world, each other, what the data can tell us about these things. And so through that project, we've done some live performances where they have actually put together some of this data and played it live with instruments. We've also done an installation here at the Barrier Island Center where a number of those sonified and natural recordings were put at stations with headphones where you could just come and listen to them and engage.
Well, it's experiential, it definitely takes the learning out of the book and into like some sort of sensory experience.
Yeah.
I think sound art is actually a very interesting. There are artists working in that.
Yes.
In that genre, I guess you would call it. I've heard some really cool things. People doing recordings of like how planetary or suns and so forth, everything emits a sound, at some level. And sometimes you have to speed it up or slow it down to be able to get it into our hearing range. But
it's been such a It's a really rewarding project. It's one of my favorite projects because everybody feels a little novice.
Yeah.
And so everybody brings their expertise, but it's much less of like, I know this and I'm an expert in it and I can tell you exactly. And it's, because when you get together, so we've done field trips where we've brought scholars from all these different fields together, and we've taken them out and let them wander the Barrier Islands in silence for like 3 hours. And it's in no sounds. You must listen. And sometimes you have it with directional mics so you can hear things in great detail. And everybody's been given, listen closely, listen far away. And then we get back together for dinner and do sort of a let's talk about what we heard. And, the coastal ecologist says like, oh, I noticed this pattern and whatever. And you think like, yeah, that's exactly what I noticed. That was what was out there. And then, the humanities scholar or the coastal planning scholar starts talking and you're like, whoa, that didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah.
And it opens entirely new conversations about how we approach these systems, how we approach each other. It's just been a really fascinating, really rich way to do interdisciplinary dialogue, which is sometimes really tough.
I want this a little bit off topic, but I once heard, I think it was a sonic artist, but who knows it? He might have been, for all I know, it was a researcher, a field researcher. Anyway, someone had the idea of taking recordings of crickets. I don't know if you ever heard this, and then slowing them down greatly, and unbelievably, if you ever get a chance, I mean, sure you can Google it.
Yeah.
A field of crickets slowed down to a certain degree sounds like a human choir.
Whoa.
Not only that, it sounds like a choir of angels. Like when you hear it, you're like, what am I hearing? It's this absolutely heavenly blend of like harmonies. You're like, what?
Yeah.
And we can't perceive it that way normally, but just by, taking technology, but then, aesthetically doing something with it, it's just very interesting to do stuff like that with sound, or it's sort of like taking kind of data and numbers or whatever it is, or something ordinary, but then you realize it's not ordinary at all. And the crickets aren't ordinary anyway. We're just used to them.
Yes, yes.
Right?
But it's amazing because it's like, most of us don't look at a cricket anymore and feel awe.
Yeah.
But when you hear a choir of angels that came from a cricket
It's
song
music.
slowed down, I feel like the awe would definitely be there.
Unbelievable that it exists. And it's like, I've thought about this before too, like where did music even come from in the human form, right? And then I thought, well, people must have heard animals and insects.
Yeah.
Birds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those are songs. And so, and again, I guess I'm touching back to that, that whole idea of like we think of ourselves as like nature's over here, and then people are here, and we're the Lord and masters of it. And it's not that way at all.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not that way at all. We're in, and this is the indigenous mode of thinking too. It's just like we are part of that.
Yes.
It's not a separate thing at all. We're part of the earth. We are just as much as the animals are inhabitants of this this planet. We are too. We have an outsized influence.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
Yes, but we're still interconnected with all of it.
Deeply interconnected. Tell me a little bit about the work you've done with the Barrier Islands Center over recent history.
Many years. So the collaboration between the Coastal Research Center and the Barrier Islands Center predates my tenure here, but it's been a really incredible collaboration. So it's often one of those, it's very organic. It's one of those processes where it's like, you need the Barrier Islands Center when that moment arises. And it's been nice because the Barrier Islands Center is so good at engaging with the community, and they are so responsive to the community. And so it's been very helpful to have a partner who does that well. So we've done the Coastal Conservatory sound exhibit here, where we did the installations, had an open house, and then left them, I think it was in for 2 or 3 months, and people could come by and listen. And it's a fun way to add something new and different. Like same way there's a photography exhibit now. We've also we did a collaboration with local artists here on the Eastern Shore. One of the things that we study are the formation of what's called ghost forests. So the forests that are dying in place because seas are coming in. So the salt is poisoning them, the water is inundating them, and they're becoming marshes. So it's actually a sign of good resilience. It means the marsh is migrating in, and this is not a place for trees anymore, and the trees are sort of migrating back. But we do a lot of research around them, but a lot of people don't know what they are, they don't notice them, they don't pay attention to them. And we knew, we had had conversations with the arts community on the shore and said, you know, how do you want to interact with us? How can we collaborate? And part of what they said was like, there's a lot of amazing landscape artists on the shore, and a lot of the artists on the shore are amazing naturalists. And they sort of said, if you can show us something new, or if you can help us see something that you get to see that we might not get to see, whether that's under a microscope or out at a hard to reach place or something, that's something we'd be really interested in, sort of coming along to see something new and different that maybe we haven't found yet. And so we thought ghost forests would be a great chance to collaborate, where we could sort of take these amazing local naturalists and sort of invite them out to the forest and help them see what's going on and talk to them about sort of the invisible processes that are leading to it. And then they had time to create art. So this was almost a 6-month collaboration. And they created the art of their choice and their medium. But they were all depicting ghost forests in various forms, or something they learned during that process. But COVID hit. And it hit like right as it was supposed to start. And so we sort of got in touch with everybody. And it was all of these dreams of like, we will wander through the forest together, like smelling soil and taking leaf samples. Like, never happened. We never went into a forest together.
Yeah, looking back on it, probably was a pretty good thing to do during COVID.
Yeah, it probably would have been the right thing to do.
It's about all I did during COVID was go outside and walk through hiking and.
Yeah, exactly. But when we got in touch with everyone was like, yes, we want to do something. Yeah. Even if it's not what we originally signed up for, we want to do something because we're all stuck at home in a pandemic. And so we, did Zoom calls and, handed out information, flyers, that sort of thing. But the artists, there's enough accessible coastline here that they went and explored on their own and found amazing things and saw these forests, and we'd get together and they could ask questions, and then the scientists would explain things and give short presentations. And so, but then we ended up with this art, and we're trying to figure out like, how do we we promised them an art show, and they've all made this incredible art, and we want people to see it. And so the Barrier Island Center came to the rescue again, and we set up an art show in the hallway of the education building, and then had someone come in and do a 360 camera tour. So then we have a virtual gallery exhibit on our website, and you can sort of go through and look at the pictures, and then there's videos of us interviewing the artists and images of the natural landscapes and graphs of the science that are all woven together to sort of give you a way to dip into the art side and the science side. And then we also did a 360 tour of a ghost forest out on a walkway at Brownsville. And so the Nature Conservancy was home to that art show, and people could come through and see it, but like 2 people at a time, right? Because we couldn't do a big opening. Right. And so it tends to be work like that we do together. More recently, that's deepened a little bit. We are part of a national project to improve public engagement with science, mostly by helping scientists understand how to be better at public engagement. And so a team at this national level, we were chosen as one of 3 sites in the country to help sort of develop a process for this. And one of the things we needed was a community partner, because they said, we will interview all of your scientists and all of your staff and find out what they think is important to do for community engagement, what they enjoy doing, how they want to spend their time. But then we want to talk to the community. And we want to hear what the community wants from you. What do they want from a research station and a project that is in their community? And so you need a community partner. Who's your community partner? Sally. Sally. So, but that's when we thought, like, who's good at bringing people together? Yeah. Who gets people to show up and talk to them candidly and tell stories and feels comfortable being authentic about what the Eastern Shore is and what the Eastern Shore needs? And it was like the Barrier Island Center. That's their magic. And so they agreed to be our community partner on this project. And we have done 1 community workshop and a focus group and some interviews where we brought in, they helped us develop a list of people that we should bring in to try and hear from all different sectors, aquaculture and artists and the ministry and natural historians, and just like who are the different people we should talk to. And we had a really wonderful, almost a full day here, getting people's ideas together. And we're still in the process of synthesizing everything. So later this year, we're going to bring some of the community members back and bring the scientists together and then try to build a web of these ideas that interconnect to guide our work going forward. And so that's been, the Barrier Island Center has been invaluable in that work, because when they talk to people, people show up. They've done the work to build the trust in the community. And that's been a real asset to have a partner that's done that work.
going to ask you about community outreach, but you kind of were talking about it when you got into the Barrier Island Center. It's almost the same. Well, everything's connected. I mean, I think the theme to what we've been talking about is this idea of interconnectivity, of not having science being in some silo or ivory tower. Like, it really needs to be part of that web that you're talking about, not just community connection, but even connection to the arts, like an interdisciplinary aspect to it. I mean, I love the idea that it becomes a creative, it can be a creative endeavor as well, and that can help engage the community and also to communicate the ideas that you're trying to in a sense, get the community's understanding and assent to doing what you're doing. So that's fascinating.
And I should note the Ghost Forest project.
Yeah.
It did exactly what we were hoping. I mean, it was amazing, the people who said, including the artists, I always saw these and I didn't know what they were.
Right.
And it's like, once you know what it is, you can't stop seeing them.
Right.
They're everywhere.
Yeah,
And so it was the artists' images did so much more for building curiosity, building interest, helping people, doing sort of, you know, it's like if you advertise, like, we're doing a talk about sea level rise and the death of maritime forests along the eastern seaboard, you get a very specific audience.
Yes.
Right? Not a lot of people show up. But when there is incredible, I mean, some of the art that was just like, it almost looked religious, you know, like beams of light coming down on these dying trees across these beautiful marshes that are sort of foggy, and you're like, I see this and I don't know what it is. And it was a chance for us to like very gently get word out of like, these are around you and they are sentinels of this process that's happening all around us.
Right.
And the art was so much more effective as a way to sort of call people in to do that. So I think whether we're doing it through the sound and the listening, or whether we're doing it by collaborating with Eastern Shore artists, we have over the years found that in general, collaborating creatively and using the fine arts is a much better way to engage with people than giving like hard science talks.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, hopefully it's both. I mean, your concepts can be conveyed, but the engagement is going to be at a different level. I mean, that's really why, you know, we've been doing these documentaries all these years, because it is kind of that idea of, I was talking about earlier, of yes, you are doing your oral history work, you're preserving in some sense these stories and this way of life, but you are also engaging the community as active creators in this in that same thing that will be a document, you know. So so it's been very interesting journey. I mean, when I started making these films, we just did the one film, Our Island Home, and I thought, well, that was good. That was a weekend of shooting, and I got those stories for them, and then it just blossomed into this, you know, in scientific terms, I guess you'd call it a longitudinal study in a sense. So I don't, and to the point now where we've been doing this for 16 years, I don't even think about these as separate films anymore.
Right.
I think it's all the
like
same project.
Threads.
And threads, and the same, sometimes the same people pop up, like, you know, go 2 films will go by, and then the third one, this person who was in that second one will be in the 5th one, and, you know, and so you start to see these films all together is really this tapestry of all of this,
and I think
life, you know.
That's how that sort of interconnectedness is how we think a lot about the coast. You know, in the research that we do, and part of it is like, I think people here on the shore intuitively know it, and they know it because they've, you know, watched the birds and worked the water, that sort of thing.
And
but
it's
then
in your bones, you know.
Right, it
if
is.
You live here.
And so sometimes that's part of what we are always trying to figure out is like, when we can see the sort of silent processes that link some of these things or change them, how do we help show that to people who are curious about it?
Right.
One of the most exciting things we've done, honestly, Gordon Campbell.
Oh yeah.
Because we study big landscape changes, and like, how do you show people big landscape changes? It's really challenging, and he is incredibly generous with his images. And one of our most popular public engagements was a gallery night. So we went to his gallery, and our scientists went and stood near images that showed something they study, and they could point to this and say, see all this that's changed in this image? This is because shrubs are expanding because the temperatures are rising, and it's changing the way sand moves. And you can see it perfectly in his images.
Incredibly detailed images that he
Exactly.
takes.
So it really helps show all the changes that are happening and all the sort of dynamics that play out here.
And again, in an artistic expression, by a local artist
Yes.
is the means through which you can, create scientific
Yeah.
understanding.
And we also have other, now that we work with Gordon and we've done things like gallery openings, we've also done things like we lost a really valuable instrument and it had a big orange buoy on it and we can't figure out how we can't find it. Call up Gordon Campbell. I was like, have you flown behind Hog Island recently? And he's like, I did see that. It's up. We found gear before because he's like, yeah, go up behind, Jimmy Kelly's cabin.
I was up there 3 days ago.
Yeah, exactly. And sure enough, there it was. It just got sucked up in a rising tide and moved somewhere else. And so it's been really helpful to be able to reach out to him and say, did that island break through during that last storm? And he usually knows.
It's a formative Eastern Shore experience to be out on the water somewhere and to get buzzed by Gordon Campbell. I'm like, oh, wait, what's that? That plane's awfully low. Oh, I know what that is.
Yeah.
And then he buzzes by you and waves and takes your picture, and I might be in a gallery somewhere.
Like usually, it's a beautiful day if Gordon Campbell's flying over you.
Yeah. I want to ask you one last question. I guess was that sort of forward-looking question, or how do you see the next 10 years? Like, what's the future for the organization you're working for, and what direction do you hope to take it in?
I hope that our sort of goal for the coming years is to keep our science really robust and keep doing, state-of-the-art, world-class research, but to come out of the shadows a little bit. We've sort of, one of the researchers calls it security through obscurity. It's like we have stayed pretty, I think originally it was intentional because we came in and built in Oyster, which is a very small community, and it was sort of this agreement of like, we won't come in and put a giant research facility in the middle of your little community. We're going to stay low key. Everything's going to be kind of quiet. Our buildings will blend in. And I think that was very helpful for a long time, and we've sort of made good neighbors out of that situation. But we haven't been out in the community enough, and people don't know enough about what we're doing. And we are already starting to shift and doing a lot more, going out and talking to people and finding out what we should be doing and trying to get better about sharing our research. And so I hope that 10 years from now, it will be much easier for people to say, I know who they are and I know what they do, and that they'll have a good impression of it, that they will have heard something or learned something that either enriched their life, just their enjoyment of this place, or helped them explain to other people why it's precious, or helped them make a decision that was important for them. So I'm excited to start sort of knitting closer bonds between the researchers and the community, and sort of just like coming out into the open and being known for what we do, but respected for it, which means we have a careful path ahead.
Well, it sounds like you're well on your way, though. Everything we've been talking about has been really about that, sort of growing roots and then reaching out to the community and being part of the community rather than just observing.
Yeah. And honestly, another important thing that I cannot skip is having students involved. So that's something when we were sort of under the radar, as you start going around and talking to people and asking, there are a number of students from the Eastern Shore that come through our facility at some phase of their career or another, whether it's they come through as a high school student, or they come through as a college intern, or they did a master's degree or a PhD with us. And then a number of them have come back and taken jobs here on the Eastern Shore. So we partner very closely with the Nature Conservancy in our research. So we will study the natural dynamics of something and then share that with them, and that changes the way they do restoration or conservation. And then we collect data on that restoration or conservation, and it sort of all feeds back and everybody does a better job. But similarly, scientists come through, and so we've had people who grew up on the shore who can come back and live on the shore and contribute to the natural systems here and come and raise families here, in part because there is a robust research community here, and there's a way for them to get those degrees and sort of find a path home. And so that's something we heard in the community conversation we had here at the Barrier Island Center, was, be explicit that you do that and that that's important and that that's a service to the community and that it's not an accident.
It's a collaboration with the community, and it's your life path in a sense.
Yes, exactly.
Where you
embodying it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been really great.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you stopping in and having this conversation with us and informing the community about what you're doing. And best of luck to you with the whole project.
I appreciate the opportunity.